The Velhari did not announce themselves. That was the first thing Commander Nora Vasquez noticed when the deep field sensors at listening post Argo 7 began screaming at 3:14 in the morning. No broadcast signal. No diplomatic ping. No standard interstellar greeting protocol that humanity had spent 60 years preparing for. Just mass, enormous, cold, deliberate mass, sliding out of fold space like a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. And then stillness. The kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful. The kind that preceded something. Nora had been awake anyway. She had a habit of not sleeping well near the border zones. A habit she had developed long before she earned her commander's stripe, back when she was a junior cartographer on Survey Vessel Mendel, mapping the gravitational dead zones along what humanity had quietly started calling the threshold. The threshold was not a political line. It was not drawn on any official document or ratified by any interstellar body. It was simply the edge of where humanity had gone and come back from safely. Beyond it, probes returned corrupted data. Beyond it, 2 crewed vessels had disappeared in the past 20 years. Not destroyed, not damaged. Disappeared. As if the universe had simply decided those ships were no longer a relevant variable. Nora had always believed something lived beyond the threshold. She just hadn't expected it to come to her first. Vasquez. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant James Okoye, was already at his station when she stepped onto the command deck, his face lit from below by the pale blue glow of the sensor array. James was the kind of person who always looked calm even when he wasn't. It was a quality Nora had once admired and now found quietly unnerving. We have 312 distinct mass signatures. Each one is somewhere between 800 meters and 4 kilometers in length. They are not moving. They are sitting at exactly 40,000 kilometers beyond the threshold marker. Exactly 40,000? To within a margin of 11 meters. Yes. Nora stood at the edge of the console and looked at the holographic field display, a 3-dimensional map of the space around Argo 7, rendered in pale greens and blues, with the threshold shown as a thin amber line and the newcomers clustered beyond it like stones dropped into still water, each one represented by a small red diamond. 312 red diamonds. Arranged not in any military formation she recognized, but in a pattern that looked, and she was aware this was absurd, like a question. "Have we identified what they are?" she asked. "Not yet. The configuration of their hulls doesn't match anything in the Xen archive. Not Keth. Not Serani. Not the Pale Builders. These are something new." "Are they scanning us?" James hesitated. That hesitation meant yes. They have been here since the moment they arrived. Not aggressively. The scan frequencies are low intensity, more like observation than targeting. But they are thorough. They've passed active scan cycles over every structure on Argo 7 twice in the last 40 minutes. They know exactly what we are. Nora pulled up a chair at the central table and sat down, which she knew surprised him. He expected her to stand. Most commanders stood in moments like this. She sat because she needed to think, and she thought better when she was low to the ground. "Send the Tier 1 contact packet," she said. "Standard universal mathematics. Prime sequences, physical constants, and binary logic trees. Everything in the protocol." "Already sent it twice," James said. 12 minutes apart. No response. "Then send it again," Nora said.
"And keep sending it.
"And get me Dr. Yuan." Dr. Mei Yuan was Argo 7's resident xenolinguist and cultural systems analyst. She was also, technically, asleep. But when Nora called her quarters and told her what was on the sensor display, the line went quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and then Mei said, with the focused excitement of someone who had been waiting their entire career for one specific moment, "I'll be there in 4 minutes." She arrived in 3. Mei was small and precise in her movements and carried with her at all times a worn cloth notebook, actual paper, actual ink, in which she kept handwritten observations about pattern systems and signal architecture. She had long ago stopped apologizing for the notebook. She pulled it out the moment she arrived on deck and flipped to a blank page. "Show me the arrangement again," she said. James projected the formation. Mei stared at it. She tilted her head. She wrote something down, crossed it out, and wrote something else. The command deck was quiet enough that Nora could hear the scratch of her pen. "This isn't a fleet formation," May said finally. "Then what is it?" Nora asked. "It's a grammar," May said, looking up from her notebook. "They're not positioned for combat or for travel. They're positioned in a spatial syntax. This arrangement means something. The ships themselves, their positions relative to each other. That's the message." She paused. "They didn't respond to our mathematics because we didn't speak first. We sent them an alphabet. They're already showing us a sentence." Nora looked at the 312 red diamonds floating beyond the amber line. "What does the sentence say?" she asked. May looked at the display for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said quietly. "But I think the first word is a name." Outside, 312 ships held their formation perfectly. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply waited, with the particular patience of something that had never once in its existence needed to hurry. Mei Yuan did not sleep for the next 31 hours. Nora knew this because she checked the bunk logs out of concern, found them empty, and then found Mei exactly where she expected, in the signal analysis room on Subdeck 4, surrounded by 3 floating holographic displays, 2 empty coffee cups, and the kind of productive chaos that only people with well-organized minds could generate. The walls were covered in Mei's handwriting. She had requested physical whiteboard panels and covered them entirely with diagrams that looked, to the untrained eye, like the fever dream of a mathematician who had given up on sanity. Nora leaned in the doorway and watched for a moment without speaking. Mei was doing something Nora had never seen anyone do before. She was taking the spatial coordinates of each ship in the Valhari formation and translating them into a geometric sequence, treating each vessel's position not as a data point, but as a phoneme in a 3-dimensional language. She was building grammar out of architecture. She was learning to read a sentence that described the positions of warships. "Tell me something useful," Nora said. Mei spun around. She was clearly not startled. She had heard Nora's footsteps in the corridor. "Their name for themselves," Mei said, "is not a word. It's a shape. The formation they arrived in, the exact geometry of it, is how they say who they are. Every culture names itself first. That's universal. They gave us their name before anything else." She pointed to the central display where she had rendered the fleet formation in white lines, connecting each ship to the next in a specific sequence. The resulting shape was a kind of spiral that folded back on itself asymmetrically. "This is their name. I've been calling them the Valhari because I needed something to call them, but that's just a human phonetic approximation of the geometric shape. What they're actually saying when they say their name is closer to," she paused looking for the right phrase, "the thing that continues after the fold." "Poetic," Nora said. "It's not poetry to them," Mei said. "I think it's physics. Or it was once. Their language started as a description of how they move through space, fold travel, specifically. The way they navigate. Their entire communication system is built on spatial relationships, not sound or light. They don't broadcast words. They broadcast positions. Which is why standard contact protocols didn't work. We were sending them audio frequencies and binary math," Mei said. "They heard noise. Imagine if someone said hello to you by making a random loud sound and then showed you a number. You'd think they were malfunctioning." Nora stepped into the room fully and closed the door behind her. "Have they moved at all?" "Not 1 meter. But," Mei held up a finger, "the formation has changed."
Subtly.
7 ships adjusted their relative positions approximately 9 hours ago, in a shift so small our standard sensors almost missed it. But the geometric relationship between those 7 vessels changed. The shape changed. They said something new.
What?
Mei pulled up a second diagram beside the first, the same spiral shape, but with 7 nodes shifted slightly, altering the asymmetry. Before the shift, the shape indicated what continues after the fold. After the shift, she looked at her notebook, then back at the display. "I think it says the thing that continues after the fold, which has been watching." The room was hushed. "They've been watching us," Nora said. "For how long?" "This known. But the tense structure in their spatial grammar, and I'm still guessing at a lot of this, I want to be clear, implies an ongoing continuous action, not recent watching. Long watching." Mei closed her notebook. Nora, I think they've known about us for a very long time. I think they've been waiting outside the threshold since before Argo 7 was built. This was the case even before we had full travel. Nora absorbed the news slowly. And the two ships we lost beyond the threshold? May didn't answer immediately. She went very still, as people do when they have thought something through but are not yet ready to say it out loud. May. I think, May said carefully, that those ships crossed a line the Velhari had drawn. Not aggressively. I don't believe they destroyed them out of hostility. But they have a concept. I've been finding it repeated in the structural grammar, a kind of geometric signature that appears whenever the formation pattern references the threshold, a concept I've been translating provisionally as the border of comprehension, the edge of what something is ready to understand. She paused. I think when our ships crossed that line, the Velhari didn't destroy them. I think they removed them from our frame of reference, for our protection, because what lay beyond the threshold was not something we were meant to encounter yet. Yet, Nora repeated. Yet, May confirmed. They're here now, which suggests they've decided something has changed. She looked at the spiral shape on the display. They've decided we're ready. Ready for what? Nora asked. May looked at her with a particular expression of someone who has an answer but knows it will rearrange everything. I think, she said, they want to show us what happened to our ships. The response came from Earth in 11 hours. Nora had expected bureaucracy. She had expected committees and escalating chains of authorization, and at least one very senior official telling her to stand down and wait for a diplomatic vessel to arrive in 6 to 8 weeks. Instead, she received a single encrypted message from the director of the Interstellar Engagement Bureau, a woman named Director Seo-Yun Park, whom Nora had met once at a conference and found to be the rare kind of official who understood that the universe did not wait for committee approval. The message read, "You are closest. You are authorized. Don't start a war. Park." That was the entirety of Nora's diplomatic mandate. She read it twice, folded it into her jacket pocket metaphorically, and went back to the command deck. May, she said, we're going to respond. How do we do it? May had clearly been waiting for this question. She had, in fact, prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who had spent her entire academic career arguing that first contact would require spatial communication and had been politely dismissed at every conference for 20 years. She was not, Nora observed, gloating. She was simply ready. We need to move ships, May said. We don't have 300 vessels to arrange. We have 7 service drones, the 2 survey probes docked on the outer ring, Argo 7 itself, and she paused, consulting her list, 1 deep field mapping unit currently parked about 12,000 kilometers away that I can call back on remote pilot. 11 objects, James said from his station. 11 is enough for a simple sentence, May said. We're not trying to write a philosophy text. We are trying to say hello, we are ready, and we ask you to please wait. Can you express all of that using 11 objects? Nora asked. I can say the thing that listens, which is here, which is willing, May said. In their grammar, I believe that's sufficient. It's an opening. An open hand. Repositioning 11 objects to create a precise 3-dimensional geometric formation proved more complicated than it sounded. The drones needed to be moved very precisely, the survey probes had to be brought back and placed at exact spots, and the deep field unit had to be directed back on a path that aligned it at a specific angle to Argo 7. May sat at the navigation console for 6 straight hours, calculating and recalculating, checking her notebook and adjusting vectors. James flew the objects with the careful patience he brought to everything. Nora watched and did not interfere. At 11:47 a.m. station time, the 11 objects achieved their final positions. The shape they formed was, from any external viewpoint, an asymmetric cluster that bore no obvious resemblance to the Velhari's massive spiral. But in 3-dimensional space, from the correct angle, the angle May had determined was the Velhari's natural vantage point based on their formation's orientation. The 11 objects described a specific geometric relationship that echoed and answered the spiral's grammar. They waited. For 47 minutes, nothing happened. Then one of the Velhari ships moved. Just one. It drifted forward, slowly, with a kind of deliberate unhurriedness, and positioned itself at the threshold marker. Not across it. At it. The enormous vessel, nearly 2 kilometers long and black in the way that deep space is black, not the absence of color but the presence of something too dense for light to affect, hung at the amber line and seemed to pause there. Then it did something the sensors had never registered before. It changed shape. Not catastrophically, not the way a vessel breaks apart. But its outer hull, which had appeared solid and inert, began to shift. Sections rotated. Panels extended and withdrew. The entire surface of the ship rearranged itself over the course of approximately 8 minutes into a new configuration, and when it was done, the ship's own hull described a geometric shape that was a direct response to the formation May had built with her 11 objects. It had spoken back. May's hands were shaking slightly as she worked through the translation. "What is it saying?" Nora asked. May looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way that Nora associated with people on the edge of something enormous. "It says," May said slowly, checking each element of the shape against her notation, "the thing that continues after the fold acknowledges the thing that listens and confirms. The willing shall be shown." James let out a long, slow breath. Nora stood very still. "Shown what?" she asked, as if in answer. And Nora would spend years afterward wondering whether it was an answer. The single Velhari ship at the threshold opened. Not a door. Not an airlock. The entire forward section of the vessel simply separated along previously invisible lines, like a flower opening at an accelerated rate, revealing that inside was not a weapon, vehicle, or threat. Inside, held in a field of pale amber light that precisely matched the color of the threshold marker, was a human ship. Survey Vessel Mendel. Nora's ship. The first vessel that had disappeared beyond the threshold. The one she had served on as a junior cartographer 16 years ago. 1 year before it went missing on a deep survey run and was declared lost with all hands. It was intact. It was whole. It showed no sign of damage or decay. And when Argo 7 sensors swept it on automatic, the life sign monitor returned a reading that should have been impossible. 23 life signs. Human. Stable.
Alive.
Nora did not cry on the command deck. She had a policy about that, not because she was cold, but because she had learned early in her career that a commander's face was a kind of instrument, and the people around her read it constantly, and she owed them clarity before she owed them honesty about her own internal weather. So she kept her face level and her voice even, and she said, "Get me a confirmed count and biometric identification on those life signs," and she waited until James had run the full scan and read her the names. 23 names. She knew 4 of them personally. Chief Engineer Rosario Vega had taught her how to read gravitational maps and made terrible coffee that she always pretended to enjoy. Pilot Second Class Danny Osei had been 26 years old when Mendel disappeared and, if no time had passed for him, was still 26 years old. Dr. Anton Pierce, the ship's geologist, had a daughter he had never met because his partner had been 3 months pregnant when Mendel launched. Captain Sarah Tran had commanded Mendel with a kind of quiet authority that Nora had spent her entire subsequent career trying to learn. "Caro," Nora said, quietly, almost to herself, the word slipping out before she could decide whether to say it. A word she had picked up from her grandmother, who used it in moments when the world shifted so completely that ordinary language wasn't equal to the moment. "Look at this. Look at what is happening." James heard it. He looked at her. He did not ask. "Open a channel to Mendel," Nora said. The channel opened with a soft tone. Static for a moment. Then the speaker crackled, and a voice came through. A voice Nora had last heard in a recorded message she had kept on her personal drive for 16 years, played occasionally late at night when she needed to remember why she had chosen this life. Captain Sarah Tran said, calmly and clearly, "Argo 7, this is Mendel. We are reading you. We are." A brief pause, and in that pause, Nora heard something that Sarah Tran almost never allowed into her voice: uncertainty. "We are trying to understand what has happened." "What is our current stardate?" James told her. The line went silent for a very long time. When Sarah Tran spoke again, her voice had changed. Not broken, Sarah Tran did not break, but it had acquired a texture it hadn't had before.
Oh, wait. 16 years, she said.
Yes, Nora said. Another silence. Then, Nora? Is that Vasquez? It's me. God.
A breath.
You were so young. I got older, Nora said. Captain Tran, Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. You are currently inside one of what we believe to be 312 Velhari vessels positioned at the boundary of Earth's threshold. The Velhari appear to be returning you to us. We don't fully understand why now, or what happened to you on the other side. When you're ready to talk about it, we need to know everything you experienced. A long pause. Then Sarah said, slowly, as if translating from some internal language back into English, they didn't take us. I want you to know that first. It wasn't hostile. We crossed the threshold on our survey run, and we encountered something on the other side. Something we weren't equipped to process. The Velhari intercepted us before it could. She stopped. Before it could do whatever it was going to do. They took us in. They kept us. They kept us safe, Nora, for 16 years, except that for us it was not 16 years. It was closer to 4 months. For months, Nora repeated. They exist differently in time, Sarah said. Not faster or slower, differently. I can't explain it well in English. They tried to help me understand it, and I got maybe 20% of the way there. She paused again. The thing on the other side of the threshold. The reason they drew the border. It's still there. They contained it again after they pulled us out. That's what their border is for, Nora. It's not a territorial line. It's a cage. They've been keeping something contained beyond the threshold for, they tried to explain how long. The number didn't translate. It was very, very long. Nora stood in the silence of that and let it settle through her like cold water. And now, she said. Now, Sarah said, they want to make a different kind of arrangement. They've been watching us grow, watching humanity develop, expand, build these listening posts and push toward the threshold. And they've made a decision. They think we're ready to know what's in the cage. And they think, she paused, and when she continued, there was something almost like wonder in it. They think we might be useful in keeping it there. Sarah Tran came aboard Argo 7 the same evening. The transfer happened without ceremony, a shuttle from Mendel, a docking tube, a pressurization sequence. And then Sarah was standing in the corridor outside the main airlock, and Nora was standing 3 meters away, and they looked at each other across 16 years of different living. Sarah Tran was exactly as Nora remembered her, compact, precise in her posture, with dark eyes that absorbed information and returned very little. She had not aged, which was the strangest part. Nora had intellectually understood that Sarah had only experienced 4 months, but seeing the face she remembered from 16 years ago, unchanged, on a person standing in a present that had moved on entirely without her, it created a kind of double vision that Nora had to consciously set aside. They did not hug. They shook hands. It was right for them. It was right for Sarah. You look like a commander, Sarah said. You look like the past, Nora said, and she meant it without cruelty. Sarah nodded slowly. I know. They walked together to the briefing room where May and James were waiting. The 3 other Mendel crew members Nora had known, Rosario, Danny, and Dr. Pierce, were being processed through medical and reunion protocols by the rest of the station staff. Nora had arranged for someone to privately inform Anton Pierce that he had a 16-year-old daughter named Celia before he heard it in a crowded room. She had thought about that detail specifically. In the briefing room, Sarah sat down, folded her hands, and told them what was in the cage. She called it, for lack of any better word, the dissolution, a term the Velhari had helped her approximate, though she was clear that their actual concept for it had no word at all, only a geometric signature that May immediately asked to see recorded. It was not a species.
It was not a conscious state.
It was not a weapon or a natural disaster in any sense. Humanity normally used those words. The closest thing I can compare it to, Sarah said, is a process. An ongoing process that, if left unchecked, disrupts the coherence of organized matter over time. Not immediately. Not explosively. Gradually. The Velhari described observing star systems near the boundary, the other boundary, the far side, where planetary bodies began to lose structural coherence over periods of millions of years. The matter didn't disappear. It just became less of itself, less organized, less able to maintain complexity.
She paused.
They think it predates organized matter in the universe. It's older than stars. It's something the universe is always doing very slowly anyway, entropy, but in the region beyond the threshold, it's concentrated and accelerated. The Velhari have been maintaining a containment architecture for longer than most of what we'd call history. Containment architecture, May said, leaning forward. Their fleet formation, the spatial grammar, the border itself. Yes, Sarah said. The threshold is not a natural boundary. The Velhari built it. Over an enormous span of time, they constructed a network of fold-space anchors positioned in a three-dimensional pattern. She glanced at May's notebook, which May was already filling, exactly like their ship formations. Because their formations are extensions of the same system. Their language, their fleet geometry, their containment architecture, they're all the same thing. The same spatial logic applied at different scales. They think in geometry because they live in geometry. Their containment system for the dissolution is written in the same language as their names. The room was quiet. And they want our help maintaining it, Nora said. Not maintaining it, Sarah said. The containment architecture has been stable for a long time, but it has gaps. Points of structural weakness that the Velhari have never been able to fully address because of their own physiological limitations. They exist in a different temporal relationship with space than we do. The way they move, they fold, means they experience spatial positions in sequence rather than simultaneously. They can build the architecture, but they cannot observe it from outside. She looked at Nora directly. We can. Humans. We exist in continuous linear time, moving through space at sublight conventional speeds when we choose to. We can be present within the architecture and observe its coherence in ways the Velhari cannot. We're not a solution to their problem. We're a perspective they've been missing. HFY, Nora said softly. It was something her grandmother said too. It meant, roughly translated from the Urdu she had carried into the family's blended household over generations. From now, this is mine to carry. It was not a burden. It was an acceptance. A taking on. Sarah looked at her with curiosity. Yes, she said, even not knowing the word.
Exactly that.
May set down her pen. They've been watching us to see if we develop the observational capacity, the deep field listening posts, the cartography programs, and the survey missions. Yes, Sarah said. Every post humans have built along the threshold has been watched and assessed. Argo 7 was the deciding factor, not because of the technology, they found the technology modest, but because of the methodology. The way Argo 7 approaches mapping. The three-dimensional relational analysis. She looked at May, the work of whoever designed the xenolinguistic observation protocol for this station. May blinked. Your work, Sarah said quietly. They found your framework in the data transmissions from Argo 7. Your spatial grammar theory, you published it 9 years ago. A theoretical paper that received, as I understand it, fairly limited academic attention. For citations, May said. 2 of them were from me. The Velhari read it, Sarah said. That paper is, in part, why they came now. May looked down at her worn cloth notebook. Her expression was the particular stillness of someone who had just learned that the most important thing they ever did was something no one else noticed. Caro, she said softly.
Just that.
The diplomatic process, such as it was, took place in space. There was no table. There was no room. There was no handshake or ceremonial exchange of flags or signing of documents. Instead, over the following 6 days, Nora and May and James flew a series of coordinated maneuvers around Argo, 7 in small 2-person survey craft, old ones, slow ones, ships that felt solid and real in a way that fold-capable vessels did not, and in those maneuvers, guided by May's continuously evolving understanding of the Velhari geometric grammar, they spoke. They spoke about the dissolution. May asked questions by repositioning her craft relative to James's in patterns that she had decoded from the fleet's responses, and the Velhari answered by making minute adjustments to the positions of ships in the massive formation, adjustments that required their sensors to be at their most precise, reading architectural shifts in vessels 2 kilometers long to extract phoneme-level information. It was, Nora thought, the most complicated conversation in human history, and it was conducted entirely in silence, in the cold dark between stations, by 3 people in small ships and 300 beings in vast ones. They learned the shape of the cage. It was not what Nora had imagined. She had imagined it as a wall, a boundary, a hard edge. But the containment architecture the Velhari had built over their incomprehensible span of history was more like a web. Thousands of fold-space anchors spread out over a huge area, each one working together with the others to create a stable field that kept the dissolution speed from going too fast. Below that threshold, the dissolution was everywhere. It was, in some sense, simply physics, simply the universe's slow tendency toward the simplest states, but above it, in concentrated form, it unmade complexity. Stars, planets, life. The web had weaknesses. Points where anchors had moved, where the vibrations had lessened over time, or where the shape had been changed by the effects of stars that the Velhari didn't foresee long ago when they set up those nodes. The Velhari could identify the weaknesses from within the architecture. But from within, they could not see the full pattern, could not see which repairs to prioritize, could not see how one weakness interacted with another across the vast volume of the web. They needed observers who stood outside the architecture and could see it whole. They needed human cartographers. They want us to map the web, Nora said on the 5th day, sitting in her survey craft 100 meters from Maze, both of them watching the formation shift through another slow, enormous statement. That's what the survey posts are for. They want us to extend our mapping programs, expand the cartographic methodology to cover the anchor network, and report the structural coherence data back to them. Not just a map, May said over the comm interpret. They need the relational analysis. They need someone to look at the whole web and say, here, this cluster of weaknesses is interacting, and if you fix this one node, it will relieve stress on 6 others. The kind of systems analysis that she paused, that I literally wrote a theoretical paper about 9 years ago that 4 people read. You keep coming back to that. I keep coming back to that, May confirmed, because it means I was right. I was working on the correct problem, but I did not know what it was. I was writing a solution, and I didn't know what it was a solution to. A pause. That's the part that will take me a while to sit with. On the 6th day, the Velhari made a new formation shift, the largest one yet, involving nearly 60 vessels adjusting their positions over a period of several hours in a slow, deliberate rearrangement that produced a geometric statement of such complexity that May spent 4 hours decoding it in pieces. When she had the full translation, she called Nora and James to the signal room and read it aloud. The thing that continues after the fold offers to the thing that listens a covenant without hierarchy. We do not ask for service. We ask for partnership between those who fold through time and those who walk through it. The cage requires both. The dissolution does not distinguish between the folding and the walking. It unmakes both. We have maintained the architecture alone for too long. We are slower than the decay. With observers, we are not. The willing shall not be servants. The willing shall be wardens. The cage does not belong to the foldwalkers. The cage belongs to what lives inside the cage, which is to say, it belongs to the universe. We are only the ones who notice first. The room was silent for a very long time. Then James, who had been quiet through most of the 6 days, said, "They're lonely." Nora looked at him. "That's what it is," he said, without any particular drama in it. "They've been doing this alone for so long that they've almost stopped believing anyone else would ever be capable of sharing it. And then we showed up and built listening posts on the edge of their cage, and one of us wrote a paper about spatial grammar that describes their own language, and they thought, finally, someone who might understand what this is." He paused. "We're not an asset to them. We're a company." May was quiet. Then she said very softly, "Ob SYMJHY." Nora spent the 7th night in her quarters writing a report. Not the official report. That would come later, drafted by committee and processed through 17 layers of diplomatic and scientific review before reaching Director Park's desk. This was a different kind of writing. A letter to herself, or perhaps to whoever she would be 5 years from now, when the decisions she was making tonight had settled into their full consequences. She wrote, "We have been given a choice that is not really a choice. Say no, and we live in ignorance of what sits beyond the threshold, and the Velhari continue to maintain the cage alone, and humanity builds its civilization on a floor we don't know is there. Say yes, and we take on a responsibility so enormous and so old that our entire history fits inside it the way a sentence fits inside an ocean. Say yes, and we stop being just a species on a pale blue dot and start being part of something structural, something the universe depends on in whatever small way." She paused. She wrote, "The dissolution is entropy. Accelerated, concentrated, weaponized by physics itself, but entropy. Entropy is the force that simplifies complex systems. Entropy transforms meaning into noise. The Velhari have been fighting it for longer than we can understand. And their argument, the argument written in the positions of 300 ships, is that the fight matters. Maintaining complexity against entropy is worth it, even though entropy always wins in the end. Even though the universe will eventually be simple regardless."
She stopped.
She thought about Rosario Vega, who is in the medical bay right now, eating her first meal in 16 years and crying quietly about it. She thought about Danny Osei, who was 26 years old in a station full of people who had been children when he disappeared. She thought about Anton Pierce and his daughter Celia, whom he had never met and who was currently on Earth living a full 16-year life that her father had simply not been present for. She thought about Captain Sarah Tran, who had come back to a world that had moved without her and who had accepted that with the same quiet authority she brought to everything. And she thought, the Velhari kept them safe. For 4 months of their time, for 16 years of ours, they kept Mendel's crew safe from something that would have unmade them. Not because they were asked to, not because there was an agreement, because they noticed." She wrote, "That's what I trust. Not the geometry, not the spatial grammar or the formation logic or the mathematics of the anchor network. I trust that they kept 23 people alive for 16 years without anyone asking them to. I trust that they waited at the threshold for 6 days without once crossing it until we opened the conversation. I trust that they said, 'We are not asking for servants.' I trust the thing James said. They're lonely." She closed the document. She sat in the dark for a moment. Then she opened her comm and sent a message to Director Park. "I recommend acceptance. Full details to follow. We have been invited to become wardens of a cage we didn't know existed, guarding the universe against a process older than stars, in partnership with beings who have been doing it alone for longer than we have existed. I know how that sounds. I am recommending it anyway. Vasquez." She went to sleep, and for the first time since before she could remember, she slept without difficulty near the border zone. The second ship, the Velhari, returned but was not Mendel. It was the Pharaoh, a deep survey vessel that had disappeared 11 years after Mendel, 5 years ago by Argo 7's reckoning. Nora had not served on the Pharaoh. She had no personal connection to its crew. But when the massive spiral formation made its slow adjustment and a second Velhari vessel glided to the threshold and opened itself to reveal an intact human ship held in amber light, she felt the weight of it as if she had 17 people on Pharaoh. For them, even less time had passed than for Mendel's crew, approximately 6 weeks. They came aboard Argo, 7 bewildered and disoriented, trying to make sense of 5 missing years with none of the 16 years of compounding loss that Mendel's crew had to absorb. Among the Pharaoh crew was a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who had been the vessel's astrophysicist. She was 41 years old in her own body's memory, and she had a precision about her that reminded Nora uncomfortably of May. Not in personality, Priya was louder, quicker to laugh, but in the quality of her attention, the way she looked at a problem. Within 12 hours of arriving on Argo 7, Dr. Anand had reviewed all of May's notes on the Velhari spatial grammar and had an observation. She delivered it to Nora and May in the briefing room with the directness of someone who did not see any point in softening her words. "The grammar has a second layer." May looked at her. "I've been working on this for 6 days," May said carefully. "I know," Priya said. "You've done extraordinary work. The first layer, the positional syntax, the shape as sentence structure, that's all correct. But when I was aboard the Velhari vessel, I wasn't just a passenger. I watched them. For 6 weeks I watched their crew, and they do have something like a crew, individual entities that move through the ship performing functions. They communicate with each other using the same spatial positioning system, but at a smaller scale, individual positioning relative to each other. And in that microgrammar, there's a structure I don't see in your analysis. She pulled up a diagram on the room's display, a series of small geometric figures, carefully sketched in a style that looked like it had been drawn from memory of something observed. Temporal indexing, she said. The grammar doesn't just say what something is, or what it does. It says when. The orientation of a position relative to the direction of fold travel, which is their version of forward in time, is whether something happened before, is happening now, or is intended to happen. Your translations have been accurate but atemporal. You've been reading their sentences without their tenses. May stared at the diagram for a long moment. Then she said, "That changes the covenant statement." "Yes," Priya said. May pulled up the translation of the 6th day's Great Formation Shift. She began reworking it with Priya's temporal indexing applied. The room was quiet except for the sound of her working. After 20 minutes, she read the revised translation aloud. It was different. Not entirely, the core meaning held. But the new reading added a dimension that the original had flattened out. The Velhari hadn't just offered a partnership in the present tense. They had described it as something they had been offering for a very long time, returning to the same position, the same open hand, repeatedly for generations, and never finding anyone to take it. And then, at the end of the statement, in the future intentional tense, they had added something May's original translation had rendered as simply, "The willing shall be wardens." The temporal index changed it to "when the willing are ready to remember that they were always meant to be wardens." Nora sat with that for a moment. "They think we knew," she said slowly. "Or that we were supposed to know. On some level." "Not new," May said. "I think the temporal structure implies something more like, it was always going to be this. They didn't choose us as partners because we proved ourselves. They chose us because the architecture requires the kind of mind we have, and we were always going to develop that kind of mind, because the architecture has been shaping the conditions for complexity and consciousness throughout the universe for as long as the Velhari have been maintaining it." She paused. "We didn't just live near the cage. We developed inside it. The cage is why there's a we to develop." The room was very, very quiet. "Caro," Nora said. The invitation came on the 9th day. May decoded it into the formation of a careful, precise statement that she and Priya worked on together for 3 hours before they were confident in the reading. The Velhari were inviting a small group of humans to cross the threshold. Not to the far side, not into the region of the dissolution. Just across, in the space the Velhari occupied, you can see the architecture from the outside. To see the whole cage. Nora brought the invitation to Sarah Tran first, before deciding anything. Sarah listened to the full decoded statement. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "When I was inside the Velhari vessel, when I was their guest for those 4 months, there was a moment where I understood what they were showing me. Not intellectually. Physically. They positioned me in a specific location within their ship, and the hull became transparent, and I was looking at the threshold from the other side." She paused. It looked like a heartbeat. A slow, enormous heartbeat. The whole architecture, all the fold space anchors, all the resonance fields was pulsing, very slowly, like something alive. And I thought, we have been building listening posts on the chest of something breathing, and we didn't know the sound we were hearing was a heartbeat. Nora nodded slowly. "You think I should go," she said. "I think someone should," Sarah said. "I think if you don't go, you spend the rest of your life knowing you were asked and you said no." Nora chose 3 people. Herself.
May.
And, after some thought, Danny Osei, Mendel's pilot, who was 26 years old and had spent 6 days back in human space looking at everything with the eyes of someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that time was not what you thought it was. He had also, it turned out, been the crew member the Valhari had communicated with most directly during the 4 months, positioning him repeatedly in specific locations, observing his responses, and giving him experiences they did not give the others. Nora was beginning to suspect that these events had not been coincidental. They flew across in a survey craft. The 3 of them were a small ship, a thin amber line, and 300 enormous vessels watching from the dark. The crossing took 3 seconds. What was on the other side was not what Nora had expected. Emptiness, strangeness, or something threatening. What was on the other side was the architecture itself, visible to the naked eye here in a way that it was not from the human side. The fold space anchors the Valhari had built were not invisible structures. They were vast objects, dark and complex, each one different in geometry from the others, positioned across an unimaginable volume of space. And between them ran the resonance fields, visible as slow pulses of light that moved from anchor to anchor, the way electrical impulses move through a nervous system. Sarah had said it looked like a heartbeat. From inside it, Nora thought it looked like a mind, vast and slow and incomprehensibly old, thinking thoughts that took centuries to complete, maintaining itself against a process that would unmake it, humming with a coherence so large it was hard to see it all at once. You had to look at one part, then move your eyes to another part, and try to hold the connection between them in your mind. May, beside her, was crying. Not from sadness. From the particular overwhelming experience of being correct at a scale that exceeds comprehension. Danny Osei said nothing. He flew the ship with total steadiness and looked at everything and said nothing. But his hands, Nora noticed, were completely still on the controls, stiller than they usually were. The stillness of deep recognition. A single Valhari vessel, the same one that had been the first to move, the first to come to the threshold, and the first to open itself, glided close to their survey craft. Not threateningly. Alongside. Its vast hull shifted slowly through a series of positions. May translated it in real time, her voice low and careful. Now you see it whole. Now you understand the weight. The cage is not a prison. The cage is a promise. The ones who build promises must live inside them. Welcome.
She paused.
Welcome, and then a shape I haven't seen before. A new geometric term. She was quiet for a moment. I think it's their word for us. Not humans. Not a physical description. I think it's a title.
She paused again.
I think it refers to those who arrived when the architecture was ready to receive them. Nora looked at the vast web of lights pulsing slowly through deep space. She thought of SYMJHY. From now on, this is mine to carry. She meant it the way her grandmother had always meant it, not as a burden, as belonging. They returned to Argo, 7 after 4 hours on the other side of the threshold. James met them at the airlock with the expression of someone who had spent 4 hours trying to be professionally calm and not entirely succeeding. He had the sensor logs ready, the communication records organized, and the relay to Director Park queued and waiting. He had, as always, done every practical thing that needed doing so that Nora could think about the things that went beyond practical. She hugged him. It surprised them both. How was it? He asked. It looked like a mind, she said. An ancient, very large, very slow mind that has been thinking the same thought for longer than we've existed. She stepped back. We have work to do. The work, in the following days, was enormous and also strangely ordinary. Nora filed reports. May and Priya Ewan began building the first formal human Valhari interface protocol, a standardized system for spatial communication that could be operated by trained cartographers without requiring May's specific level of intuitive genius. James worked with Earth to quickly grow the deep field mapping program by setting up 7 new survey stations around the threshold area. Each station would have cartographers trained in the new interface protocol and would be equipped with the precise positioning systems needed to communicate using Valhari's geometric grammar. Director Park responded to Nora's recommendation with a single line. I knew it would be you, Park. Sarah Tran was offered a return to Earth and politely declined. She asked instead to be stationed at Argo, 7 as a liaison between the Mendel crew, who were collectively the humans with the most direct experience of Valhari communication, and the new diplomatic framework. Nora agreed immediately and felt, saying yes, something that she recognized after a moment as relief. She had not realized how much she had missed Sarah Tran's presence until it was suddenly available again. Anton Pierce requested leave to go to Earth and meet his daughter. It was granted without question. Danny Osei asked to stay. Nora found him on the observation deck on the fourth night after their return, sitting in front of the viewport that faced the threshold. The amber line was still there. Beyond it, the formation still held. 312 ships, patient, enormous, and precise. "You knew something when we were out there," Nora said. "I saw it in how still you were." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I was on their ship, the 4 months, they communicated with me differently than with the others. Not with the ship's hull geometry. Smaller. Closer. They would position themselves near me, their bodies, their physical forms, and the relationship between them created meaning. It took me a while to understand it. But eventually," he paused. "Eventually I realized they were asking me questions. Specific questions. About how we experience time. About what it feels like to move through space continuously rather than folding. About linear memory." He was quiet again. "I think they were studying me the way May was studying them. Both directions. And when we were out there in the architecture, I understood something they had been trying to ask me the whole time." He paused. "They wanted to know if we were afraid of it. The slowness. The scale. The way the architecture operates in time. Centuries-long thoughts. Millennium-long conversations. They wanted to know if beings like us, who live so briefly, who experience time so acutely, could endure being part of something that moves so slowly." "What did you tell them?" Nora asked. "I didn't have to," Danny said. "When I saw the architecture and didn't flinch, that was the answer." He looked at the viewport. "They weren't asking if we were capable. They already knew we were capable. They were asking if we were willing to accept that most of the work would happen after we were dead. That we would lay groundwork that our children's children's children would continue. That being a warden of the cage means accepting that your individual life is a tiny part of a very long project." Nora stood beside him and looked at the amber line. "Ab SYMJHY, she said. Danny looked at her. "What does that mean?" "From now on, this is mine to carry," she said. "And then you pass it on. And it keeps being carried." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what they were asking." 6 months later, the first of the new survey stations came online. It was called Threshold Anchor 1, a name that was both practical and, Nora felt, appropriate. Its crew of 12 included 4 cartographers trained in the Spatial Grammar Interface Protocol, 2 deep field analysts, a structural coherence specialist that May had personally supervised through her new training curriculum, and a xenolinguist named Dr. Rafael Lima, who had read May's original paper all those years ago and been one of the 2 external citations. When May heard that, she laughed for a long time. The Velhari responded to the activation of Threshold Anchor 1 with a formation shift that May translated as the architecture receives a new voice. It was, by the standards of their communication, an extraordinarily brief statement. It was also, by those same standards, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The mapping began. What the cartographers found, working in concert with the Velhari formation's responses to their positional queries, was what Nora had expected intellectually, but not emotionally. The cage was enormous. Not just spatially enormous, though it was spanning a volume of space that made the entire range of human exploration look like a single room in a huge house, but temporally enormous. The architecture had been built across such a span of time that some of the earlier anchors showed physical characteristics of materials that no longer existed in the universe in their original form, transformed by stellar events, adapted by the Velhari over generations, carrying within them the evidence of every era of their civilization's history. The Velhari were not just the builders of the cage. They were the living record of everything that had happened since the cage was built. Their entire culture, their language, their physiological relationship with fold space, all of it had been shaped by the task of maintaining the architecture. They had built a civilization around a responsibility and had eventually forgotten that anything had existed before it. They were the oldest ongoing project in the known universe. And they were worn out. Not exhausted. Not failing. but tired in the way that anything that has been doing one thing for a very long time becomes tired, not of the thing, but of the aloneness of it. Nora wrote a second letter to herself. Not a report, not a diplomatic document. Sitting in her quarters on the night that Threshold Anchor 1 transmitted its first full structural coherence map of a 17-anchor cluster, a map that identified 3 weak resonance nodes the Velhari had not been able to locate from within the architecture, and transmitted the repair coordinates to the Velhari formation in spatial grammar that the station's new protocol system generated automatically. The Velhari repaired 2 of the 3 nodes within a week. She wrote, "I think the loneliest thing in the universe is not being the last of something. It's being the only one of something for so long that you stopped imagining anyone else. And then someone arrives and says, 'We see what you're doing.' And the loneliness doesn't disappear, but it changes. It becomes something you're carrying with someone else now." She wrote, "Caro, look at this. Look at what is happening." She wrote, "We found the oldest thing in the universe, and it was waiting for us." A year after the Velhari arrived at the threshold, they made a final formation shift. It was not announced differently from any other shift. May's monitors simply flagged it at 7:23 in the morning, and she called Nora, and Nora came to the signal room still carrying her coffee. But this shift was different in character from everything that had come before. It was not a communication. It wasn't a question or an answer or a covenant statement. May and Priya and Dr. Lima worked on it together for most of the day, and when they had the translation, they brought it to the full senior staff. The briefing room held Nora, Sarah, James, Danny, May, Priya, Dr. Lima, and Rosario Vega, who had, over the course of the year, become the station's chief engineer and applied her particular engineering genius to the problem of building positioning drones precise enough to communicate in spatial grammar without requiring a human pilot, which had tripled the station's conversational capacity with the Velhari and earned her a commendation from Director Park. May read the translation aloud. It was long. It was the most complex statement the Velhari had made in an entire year of daily communication. It described in temporal sequence the entire history of the cage, abbreviated, impressionistic, a sketch more than a portrait, but a sketch drawn by the beings who had lived every moment of it. The building of the first anchors. The first containment event, when the dissolution had surged and been held back. The long, slow centuries of maintenance. The losses, and there have been losses, Velhari ships and Velhari lives and whole generations who had grown up and grown old maintaining an architecture they had not built and would not live to see completed, if it was ever completed. And then, at the end of the historical recounting, a final statement. May's voice, when she read it, was hushed. The Foldwalkers have carried the architecture for longer than anyone can remember. Memory begins where the architecture was already there. The Foldwalkers do not remember a time before the cage. The Foldwalkers acknowledge, the cage is not the purpose of the Foldwalkers. The cage is the condition inside which the Foldwalkers became what they are. The Foldwalkers exist because the cage remained intact. The walking through time once exists because the cage held. Every consciousness this universe has made exists because the cage held. She paused. The Foldwalkers offer the walking through time ones, not the cage. The cage cannot be offered. It belongs to itself, to all, to the holding. The Foldwalkers offer this, the knowledge that you were never alone in the universe. Something very old was always here. The architecture that supported your existence was not a wall. It was a gift. The Foldwalkers could not say so until the walking through time ones were ready to hear it. They are ready. The room was completely still. May set down her notebook. "That's," she started. She stopped. She tried again. "That's not a diplomatic statement. That's not a request, offer, or covenant. That's an," she paused, looking for the word. "That's an embrace." Nobody spoke for a very long time. Then Rosario Vega, who had survived 16 years compressed into 4 months and come back to a world that had moved without her and found her footing in it with the practicality of someone who knew that grief and work were not opposites, Rosario Vega said quietly, "We should write back." "What do we say?" James asked. Everyone looked at Nora. Nora thought about her grandmother. She thought about a word carried forward through generations, through migrations, through the long human project of living on. The word that meant look at this, that meant this is mine to carry, that meant the universe was always bigger and older and stranger than you thought, and that did not stop you from belonging to it. She thought about 23 people kept alive for 16 years by beings who owed them nothing. She thought about a paper that 4 people read and an alien civilization that read it and decided the time had come. She thought about a cage built to protect everything that lived inside it and the builders who had never called it a cage until they found someone who could share the word. She said, "We say thank you. And we say we know what it is to carry something across time without knowing if it will be received. And we say..."
She paused.
She thought of the right shape for it. We say, HFY. From now on, this is ours to carry together. May looked at her. She picked up her pen. She turned to a new page in her worn cloth notebook, the one with the paper and the ink and all the shapes of an alien language pressed into it across 100 filled pages. She wrote it down. Outside, 312 ships began the slowest, most precise formation shift they had yet made, a movement so gradual and so exact that it would take 3 full days to complete, and when it was done, the shape it described in 3-dimensional space would be the largest and most complex geometric statement the Velhari had ever produced. May and Priya and Dr. Lima would spend 2 weeks translating it fully. But even in its first few hours of motion, before the shape was complete, before the translation was possible, the change in the formation's character was immediately perceptible to everyone on Argo, 7 who watched the sensor displays that day. It no longer looked like a question. It looked like the beginning of a very long answer. And